Our next panel follows on the theme of our first panel. It is titled, Are Big Cities Still Good Places to Work and Live? We are very fortunate to have prominent economists and leaders from our region. I will introduce them. First, we will have Gilles Duranton, who is a professor of real estate at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and holds the Dean's Chair in Real Estate. His research focuses on urban and transportation issues. His work is concerned with land use, urban growth, and the estimation of the costs and benefits of cities and clusters. He's also interested in the effects of transportation infrastructure on urban development and the evaluation of local policies. He is joined by his colleague, Jessie Hanbury, who is an assistant professor of real estate at the Wharton School. Her research interests lie at the intersection of urban economics, trade, and industrial organization. She has written and utilized detailed data on retail sales to characterize prices and availability vary across U.S. cities with an aim to look at the implications on household living expenses. They will be presenting jointly, followed by a discussion where they will be joined by Mark Morial, who is the president and CEO of the National Urban League. Welcome, Mark. The National Urban League is a historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization providing direct services that impact and improve the lives of more than 2 million people nationwide. He was formerly the mayor of New Orleans from 1994 to 2002 and helped to lead that city's renaissance. Also joining us is Kathy Wild, who is the president and CEO of the Partnership for New York City, the city's leading business organization, and a longtime friend of the New York Fed. Welcome, Kathy. The partnership, as you all know, is dedicated to working with government, labor, and the civic sector to build a stronger New York with a focus on education, infrastructure, and our economy. She is an internationally known expert in housing, economic development, and urban policy issues. Joining us also today to moderate this session is Lauren Weber, who is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She writes about workplace issues and employment in the Wall Street Journal's corporate bureau in New York. Her stories often explore topics such as workforce development and skills, contingent work, compensation, the bonds between employers and workers, and the intersection between economic trends and the on-the-ground practices of employers. I like that ringtone. So with that, welcome to our panelists. Welcome to all of you who are joining us. And I will turn it over to Jessie, who will begin their presentation. Thank you.
We can't see the slides from here.
I see them on here.
Watch the
Great. Well, while the slides are coming up, thank you so much for the invitation to present this work today. This has been a great opportunity for Gilles and I to start engaging with thinking about the long-run impact of COVID on cities. Our work, you can think of it in this presentation, will take maybe a more structured approach to some of what we heard in the first session in terms of applying a bit of economic modeling. So let me start, there's a slide that will come up, but let me start by just broadly outlining our argument. Can I have that? Outlining our argument when we figure that out. We are going to start with the notion that once, which we thought they would have by now, but unfortunately haven't, the health risks associated with COVID subside. The long-run permanent impact of COVID is going to be related to this shift to working from home. So really related to what we heard about in the first session. So we posit that the shift to working from home is going to impact people's residential location decisions and in turn, the spatial distribution of economic activity, particularly thinking about within cities, in two ways. The first is going to act as what we are going to refer to as a commuting dividend. Effectively, as was discussed in the first session, people are going to have fewer days that they have to go to work, right? So they get some time back, but also this makes living in the suburbs more attractive, right? So if you live in the suburbs, it's less costly for you to be commuting into work. Second, there's going to be a home office tax where, oh great, where, yeah, what? Okay, next. I'm just going to say next. These slides don't work well for this. And two more next. One more, and then stop. Okay, no, back. Sorry about that. Okay, so there are these two impacts on people's residential location decisions. The first is this commuting dividend, makes it less costly to choose to live in the suburbs. The second is something that is going to affect everyone, regardless of whether you're living in the suburbs or not, which is what we're going to call sort of the home office tax. Presumably, at some point, you're going to want, if you're working from home regularly, some space to do so at home. Okay, and so this is going to increase the amount of housing that you want to consume or purchase or rent. And this increase in the amount of housing that you want to consume or rent is not going to bring you extra utility per se. So this is why we're calling it a tax, right? So in order to work from home, you're going to have to buy more housing in order to consume, or rent more housing in order to consume the same amount. And so we're going to call these dual work from home shocks that we're going to show through the model, and they may have already had these impacts, are going to have two direct impacts. The first direct impact is going to be that they're going to flatten the rent gradient from city centres. So we're going to be thinking about a rent gradient where rents are high in the city centre and they're lower out in the suburbs. And we're going to have a flattening of this gradient that it turns out, as Jules is going to present, the flattening that's predicted through the model is going to be roughly similar to what we've actually seen in terms of the flattening of that rent gradient to date. The second impact is that it's going to expand the area in which developers can profitably build, or people are going to want to spend money to reside. So this is going to mean that in cities that can grow and expand spatially, you will see them doing so, and they will probably have quantity effects, people moving to those cities. So that's in the shorter run. In the medium run, there are going to be effectively endogenous responses by local businesses. The first response that we're going to see is that less foot traffic or footfall in city centres with fewer people going into work every day is going to mean there's effectively less purchasing power coming into the city to purchase amenities, and there'll be a reduction in or exit from businesses. And this might, as I'm going to show, reverse some of the gentrification that we've seen in US cities over the past couple of decades. The second impact is that there's a potential that when you have less people coming into work, right, there's going to be lower agglomeration benefits. And this, we're going to be sort of looking at this and thinking about, what's the scale of those agglomeration benefits, but this is obviously something that could, change over time as remote technologies and remote work practices become more, better developed. in order to bring some of these agglomeration benefits to remote workforces and remote teams. And then finally, this all sounds a little resume sort of their path towards becoming consumption centres. The idea that people will be living or coming into the city to consume, not necessarily because they're working there. Next. So the structure of the talk that Jill and I are going to go back and forth on a bit is starting with just looking at some stylized facts. What is the impact of COVID on cities thus far? And these are going to be the facts that motivate our model. We're then going to demonstrate, which you're probably convinced of already from the first panel, some evidence that work from home is going to persist, and then we're going to think about the impact a textbook model of residential locations in the city. Then we're going to layer into this model some heterogeneity to think about the impact not just of work from home on the individuals who will be working from home, but recognizing that there are going to be two types of individuals or various degrees of working from home, and that there's some relationship between whether you work from home and your socioeconomic status. And then finally, we're going to think about some of these medium run effects with the impact on endogenous amenities and agglomeration. Okay, so the impact of COVID on cities thus far. Next. The stylized facts here are the donut effect, first off, in migration, the fact that we saw during 2000 and into 2001, migration from city centres out into the suburbs. We saw some migration towards less dense cities, but this was much less pronounced. So our focus here is really going to be thinking about residential location decisions within within a representative city. So you could think of this being within New York. Okay, and we're not going to focus as much on the quantities. The model is going to produce predictions on the rent gradient. So not how location decisions vary as we face these work from home shocks, but instead how prices respond. And that's what we're going to be looking at, matching the data. And here the donut effect in the data is showing that less dense, more suburban locations further from the city centre have been seeing rent or price increases relative to downtowns. And these patterns are mimicked in the commercial rent gradient, although we'll be focusing on price and rents. Okay, so this is the change in this rent gradient. So this is some data from Arpit Gupta and co-authors' work. On the left-hand side, you see the change in log rent by distance to the city centre. And what you can see is this was this is 2020, that rents were decreasing near the city centre and increasing further out to the suburbs. We saw a similar, though less pronounced, change in the house price gradient, where house prices continued to increase, perhaps reflecting expectations of this home increased demand for housing associated with work from home. Next. So that shows the data up through 2000 or 2020, and you might think, well, things have reversed by then. So this plot, which Nick showed earlier today, is showing that first, what was happening in 2020 is up to the 2021. It's that dip in the rents in the highest density zip codes near city centres. And instead, you see in the suburbs and the exurbs increases in rents that persisted. City centres and high density zip codes joined in the rent increases post-2021, but they have not caught up. Right? So the focus of what we're going to be looking at is, to what degree is this gap in prices between the suburbs and city centres going to persist in the long run? So we're going to propose that this gap will persist, because we're going to see there's some permanence in work from home. Next. And so some data to support this idea is that in the top 10 metro areas, this is effectively a measure of footfall in offices in downtown in these top 10 centres, remains at below 50% of what it was back before the pandemic in early 2020. Okay, so we saw this severe dip, but it really hasn't returned very strongly. And you can see New York here, it's around that 40% mark at the moment. And this is striking relative to changes in traffic to consumption locations. So it seems that people haven't decided to permanently consume at home, right? As the health risks associated with the pandemic have subsided, people are increasingly going back to NBA games, traveling, going to movies, eating at restaurants, right? And we're back to, 80% upwards in the amount of consumption activity, in-person consumption activity that's happening. But what is persistent and relatively persistent is this reduction in in-person work. Okay, so that's going to be the focus of what we're going to be thinking about as impacting, in terms of impacting residential location decisions moving forward. Sure.
So we'll be moving back and forth. I'll give you 1 second to get attuned to a very different accent and a very different way of speaking. Next. And next again. Yes, so that we have the whole slide. So we want to bring together a lot of what Ed and Nick have said before within a consistent framework. So, work from home has commuting benefits and costs. So Jesse will have talked about that. Residents are adjusting their housing choices in cities. So we've seen a lot of people moving and changing their housing arrangement and stuff. So there's been a lot of turmoil, and the market has actually become extremely well lively. Then what we've seen so far is a tiny, people left New York in the beginning, then they sort of came back. But the flows of migrations between cities so far have been somewhat limited. So we are not going to consider that, at least in the first step. And housing supply also in the first 2 years is limited. As Ed has argued, there's actually a lot of new constructions in some places that are getting started, but they're not coming live yet. So we are going to think about the world we live in at this point, and then that will allow us to to move forward. So we have this, textbook model that we teach in urban economics to all students. And it works so it turns out that it works very well. You're going to ask, okay, I'm not an academic, who cares about that? So we're going to care about that beyond just, okay, it works nicely, because that's actually allowing us to quantify the effects of work from home in a consistent framework. So we can actually say, okay, this is actually X% of income and so on and so forth. And then we can also use that framework to think ahead. So far, we've been living in a world where people have readjusted within cities, with cities that are pre-pandemic cities. Then so we'll be able to see when new margins open, when cities are starting, when new constructions and so on and so forth. Other way, we're thinking about that. Not that we're making strong predictions, of course, but that's a way to think about that. And then that's also a way to add more elements to this basic model and think about increasing segmentation, agglomeration effects, amenities, and so on and so forth. Next. So this is a very, very simple world. So there's a center, and the city is expanding outward where people live. And there's a fixed urban fringe. So in New York City, the urban fringe, as I estimated in the data, is about whatever. Sorry, I'm a metric person, so I need to think every time about how many miles. So it's about 60 miles. And there's a fixed supply of housing where people are choosing where to live and how much housing to consume. One of the key trade-offs is that housing is going to be cheaper in the model at the periphery, endogenously cheaper, and people living there will be able to consume more housing, but the counterpart to that will be, of course, paying higher commuting costs. Next. So this is a world think it's a very stylized works where things end up looking like this. So on the vertical axis, this is the price of housing, and on the horizontal axis, this is distance to the center. And this is a world where endogenously, again, we're going to derive a situation based on preferences about housing and commuting costs. We're going to get a world like this. And what's really important to keep in mind is that the slope of that curve will actually reflect commuting costs. So this is really the key insight of that model. There's this trade-off between living closer. So my neighbor lives a little bit closer to the center. Same house. I'm willing to pay a little bit more to live in that house, up to the point where that's going to offset just my commuting costs, my reduction in commuting costs. So you see that this slope is actually going to reflect what commuting costs. And we're going to see with work from home, we're seeing a big change in commuting costs. If you work only 3 days a week, or if you go to work only 3 days a week instead of 5, that's a 40% reduction in commuting costs. So that's going to lead to a flattening of that curve. Next. So we're going to take some numbers, not that we are fully attached to those numbers. We think at the moment this is the best guess, instructed by Ed and Nick, but really this is, if you want to change one of the numbers, I'm quite happy to rerun that with slightly different numbers, of course. So we're going to consider an increase in work from home from essentially 0 to 1.5 days a week. So it's a 30% rate of work from home. So 30% of the time you basically stay home. That's a 30% reduction in your amount of commuting. I would love to talk about congestion and stuff. That's another side of my life. I really like it, but here I'm going to ignore all those effects. Then what we know also, there's this nice paper from Tiwari and Stanton from the Harvard Business School where, oh, can you go back? No, next. Where they look at pre-pandemic, all else equal, whatever that means, it's always really hard trying to compare two households in the same commuting zone, with one having someone that works remotely and the other not having anyone working remotely. So what we find is that with the households where there's somebody working remotely are paying anywhere between 7 and 9% more in terms of housing costs. They tend to live in slightly nicer locations and they consume more housing. Typically, there's an extra half room that they consume. So we're going to think that there's something maybe like a 10% work from home tax. It's a little bit on the high side, but that's about the 10% work from home side. I'm going to go back to productivity in my second intervention. For now, I'm going to think that productivity at home and at work is the same. Next. So that world is going to lead us, to this flattening of the Bid-Rent curve, because what's going to happen is that the central locations are losing their accessibility advantage. When you work 5 days a week and you have to do this really bad commute 5 days a week, living closer to the center is a big advantage. When it's only 3 days a week, it's less of an advantage. And at the same time, those remote locations are going to become more attractive because, again, like doing it 5 days a week was this huge trek from 40 miles away. Now you're only doing whatever 2 or 3 days a week, and that's going to be much easier. So you'll be willing to pay more to live in those locations. So there will be this flattening of the rent gradient. It's going to rotate around some points. Next. And then because we're also getting richer. Suddenly, we're saving real resources because we're only commuting 3 days a week instead of, or 1.5 days a week, sorry. So instead of 5. And in that case, it means that we're actually saving resources, and that's going to make us richer, and that's going to make us willing to consume more housing and more of the other stuff as well, but more housing. So this means that there will be also an increase in prices. Next. So let me go quickly on the commuting tax. We want to keep it reasonably simple. So, if you need to spend 10% or if you need to devote 10% of your house, we're going to assume that you no longer will enjoy it for this home office. And then whether or not that's going to lead you to be willing to consume more housing or less housing will depend on the price elasticity of the demand for housing. So if if the demand for housing is inelastic, you tax, work from, so well, you're able to devote this 10% well, of your house to the home office. And you still want to consume more housing because you've lost 10% of your house and you want to expand a little bit. So that would be really expanding the demand for housing. If instead the demand for housing is really elastic, in that case, you want to move away from housing and do some other things. We think this is not a reality. So here, for simplicity, we're going to assume that this elasticity is one which is not too far from reality, so that actually, well, this tax is not changing things very much. It's just taking away stuff from you, but you're not willing to change because of this tax your housing well consumption very much. Next. So we're going to think about a world where people devote about 30% of their expenditure on housing, which is the world we live in. That's what the data were telling us. And your typical city, we need to find a city. So New York is a bit special. So we started working with a more mainstream city, and the median American city, or the median person living in urban America, lives in Tampa, Florida. So it's a city of 2.4 million people, and the physical extension of that city is about 40 miles. And when we look at urban America, so actually that last bullet point is a lot of work, we estimate that the housing supply is increasing with elasticity about 0.5 as you move away from the center. So it would be 1 if everything was equal and the city was expanding over 2 dimensions. It would be 0 if it was only constant over 1 dimension. Here you see that it's about 1.5. Next. So then we need to value commuting, which is a big complicated exercise. So let me jump through some things. First, the textbook model is telling you that commuting is really, really important because everybody needs to commute to the center. In reality, this is not true. In reality, we actually estimate that as you move further away from the center, you tend to commute a little bit longer, but not a huge amount longer. So if you are 10% further away from the center, your commute is going to be on average 2% longer, not 10% longer. So it means that when we do the valuation exercise, we don't want to exaggerate what's the importance of commuting. So we deviate slightly from the standard model. Actually, we'll assume that this is not fully proportional, but less than proportional. That's actually then consistent with the data. It means that a person close to the center will commute for about 8 miles, and a person at the edge of Tampa will commute on average about 15 miles. Then we need to value that. So the median US worker makes about $42,000 per year. Traditionally, people value commuting time at about 50% of the wage. That's the value of time. Recent evidence is telling us that maybe we should be shifting this number up slightly because commuting is not very pleasant, right? We dislike commuting, so it means about 60%. The IRS is telling us that the cost of a vehicle in 2020 was about 50 cents per mile. I just got reimbursed from a trip. It looks like this is now 59 cents per mile for 2022, but it won't make a huge difference. The American commuter commutes at an average speed of 27 miles per hour. So that's adding the cost of the vehicle is adding an equivalent of 70% of the wage. So this means that actually the equivalent cost of a daily commute is about 18% of income for somebody living at the urban periphery, at the urban fringe, and about 8% for someone living close to the center. Next. So then we try to replicate the world without work from home, and our model is predicting that the gradient will be about minus 0.1, which is really, really close to what we estimate empirically, slightly higher, but fairly close to what we estimate empirically. So on average, it's actually minus 7% for the whole of metropolitan areas with the US. And because things get steeper when you consider larger metro areas, we get about minus 9% instead of minus 10 for those that are a million and above, like my fake Tampa. So it means that for the city as a whole, the cost of commuting is about 15 to 16% of income. So it means that with a very naive estimate, if we take away 30% of that with work from home, that's a nearly 5% gain in city income. Nick Bloom was saying that people were willing to accept a 10% discount on their wages, up to a 10% after tax. This is really, really close, right? This is the same sort of magnitude, same sort of number. Next. So then let's play, that model predicts what's happening before COVID well. So now let's have 30% of work from home, 30% reduction in commuting costs. That's going to flatten with the gradient, and that's going to flatten with the gradient exactly like Gupta et al. Measured. It works. It works. So we think it's a nice thing. So we are predicting a decline in house prices by about 10% at the center and an increase at the urban fringe by about 8.5% at the periphery. That's also very much in line with the donut-well estimate of Nick Bloom and his co-author and some of the others as well. So in that case, if we take the model and look at everything, all the readjustments, people were adjusting with the consumption, some of them were living well further away now, with the center being slightly less dense and so on and so forth. The increase in equivalent real city income, thanks to the work from home and dividend, is very, very close to the naive estimate, still about 5%. Next. So then when I look at the 10% of his tax, home office tax, we devote again about 30% of our income, 1/3 of our income to housing. So that's basically a loss that's equivalent to a reduction of 3.5% of income. So it means that overall, there's been a lot of turmoil as people readjust and stuff, but the aggregate gain is sort of really tiny. It's sort of really tiny, so we're talking about small peanuts at this point. Next. So I think that's actually an interesting graph. So we are living within a world where rents at this urban fringe 40 miles away from the center of Tampa have gone up quite a bit. So it means that developers, it was just about profitable. Sorry, I shouldn't be doing that. It was just about profitable, to build, at the periphery when the curve was blue. Now that this is higher, it's giving you a huge incentive. So Ed Glazer was talking about those numbers and he was slightly worried about them. We are perfectly cool with Jesse. Yeah, we understand there are some macroeconomic implications and some other things, but that may be happening. But we are perfectly cool because, that's going to create, indeed, people want to consume more housing, and at least in some places, next, they're going to get it. And when we look at our model, 10% increase, something that's pretty flat, that implies a big urban expansion. So, if you let things happen, my Tampa, the fringe of Tampa will move from 40 miles to 70 miles away from the center of Tampa. You're going to go to Orlando quickly, right? So that's a huge, because again, very flat, a big level increase. We should be observing a lot of new construction, and it looks like there's some early signs that this is indeed happening. Next. So cities will expand, and the demand will actually be for considerable expansion. On the supply side, I know many cities will not let that happen. I know that. So it means that in the long run, we may actually see a lot of reorganization between cities. Places that allow growth, for growth to take place, seeing new activities, whatever, the Charlottes of the world and the San Jose of the world being very well limited and stuff, will not let that happen, so they will keep those really high levels, but some other places will actually grow and expand.
Okay, so now I'm going to start thinking, adding to a layer to the model, which is, I guess, addressing what the title of the conference is, which is thinking about sort of an equitable future for cities. And so just, appreciating that not everyone will be working from home. Right? So here we're thinking about the spatial sorting of heterogeneous households, effectively. Next. Okay, so as we heard this morning, there is a skill bias in which jobs, I'm going to say, are remotable. Right? So college graduates are more likely to work in occupations that can be done remotely. Okay, so how are we going to think about this in the context of the model? Well, we're going to adapt the textbook model, as has been done previously, to allow for two types of households, which I'm going to index by S. So think of S as being an indicator for, do you have a college degree or not? Okay, and so 0 is going to be if you're not a college graduate, and 1 if you are a college graduate. Next. And so I'm going to do this in pictures. The way we think about this in the standard model is that you effectively have college graduates are in blue, non-college graduates are in black, and to a first order approximation, that there has been a lot of gentrification and moving of college graduates, like to downtowns, still college graduates disproportionately live out in the suburbs because they can afford and they value housing more than the fixed, being able to save on the fixed cost of commuting to work. Okay, and so what this plot is showing you is that non-college graduates are willing to effectively pay more to live downtown. College graduates are willing to pay more to live in the suburbs, and this simple model predicts perfect sorting, right? So you live, if you're a non-college graduate, up to X tilde, right, here. And if you're a college graduate, you live further out into the suburbs, okay, where you can outbid the other type, okay? In reality, of course, this isn't the case. This just gives you a sense of the general tendency of one type or the other to live downtown is how you should be thinking about this. Okay, next. So then when we layer in work from home, there are two ways we can think about it. Let's start by thinking about it simply as college graduates can work from home. All right, so effectively what we see is we see a shift in their bid rent function from the blue curve to the red work from home curve. Okay, so what do we see happen? We see effectively it's those college graduates who are moving further out to the suburbs. Right? Potential benefit of this on the utility side is if we are thinking about quantities, this relieves some of the housing demand and the number of dollars going after housing in downtowns that has driven so much of the price increases that have made gentrification and welfare decreasing for lower income households and incumbent residents, okay? So there's some, silver lining to this. Another way you can think about the shift is that you'll have some college graduates who work from home and they're going to live in the exurbs. Some be more likely to live in the exurbs. Some college graduates who continue to commute in maybe on a hybrid basis or commute in regularly who live in the inner suburbs. But then still you get this benefit to urban neighbourhoods of decreasing rents. I don't think of decreasing rents as a bad thing per se in downtowns because it creates opportunities for more sort of equitable, a more equitable residential mix in the city. So in terms of the change in utility generated by this, the potential for reverse gentrification, I think is there and potentially a good thing based on the research I've done looking at the welfare effects of gentrification, which have really been a boon and increased welfare inequality nationally. Next. So I'm now going to start moving what we're talking about in this model to start appreciating the fact that this isn't just about where people live, it's about the broader distribution of economic activity and workplaces and the availability here of consumption amenities, and amenities are going to adjust in response to where people are choosing to live. Next. So city centres, right, offer a greater density, here you see on the left, of non-tradable amenities. Right, so think bars, restaurants, gyms. This is food retail and restaurants, food retail in red and restaurants in blue. And so this is showing you that there's much higher density of these establishments downtown relative to at the periphery of cities. On the right, what you see is that it's not just a higher density, there's actually much higher quality. Right? So this is the idea of the consumer city. This actually shows that there's some high quality in the very far suburbs, but if you continued this on looking from 2000 through to the beginning of 2020, these gradients just only increased, where this is effectively the gentrification of urban amenities that we have seen over time. Next. So this is pre-COVID, right? And pre-COVID, the centrality of services was attracting college graduates downtown, so shifting that bid rent function of your college graduates, and also amplifying any of the other forces that were driving urban gentrification, like the reduction in crime and the increase in the long hour premium. So this was effectively wanting to be closer to work to reduce commutes. Next. So with greater work from home, endogenous amenities we expect are going to amplify the reverse, right? The adjustment of endogenous amenities. We've seen already in the data the de-densification of urban workplaces has induced a lot of store closures. We've already talked about the impact on retail. Generally, we think that the reduced office worker foot traffic is going to make downtowns less attractive places to live. And then there's also this endogenous amplification effect where if I can't get lunch at all the places I used to want to get lunch at, do I actually want to come into work, or do I want to prefer to work from home? So it could also amplify the work from home effect, which I think is something that we'll discuss in the discussion of this is something to be managed, right, if we want to retain amenities downtown. Next. Okay, so this is going to effectively act in a very similar way to that direct commuting dividend, right? So the commuting dividend will have the initial shock of reducing the attractiveness of downtowns for the high incomes or the college graduates, anyone who can work from home, and then the non-tradable service exits that are going to leave with that business will amplify the effect, right? This is not just about the distribution of this economic activity. It's actually negative for the degree of consumption activity and economic activity at a more aggregate level. Because the issue is that there is a reason why downtowns provide that density of these consumption amenities. They have a competitive advantage because they had all of that foot traffic, right? When you have a less dense residential locations and people working from home, we're not going to necessarily see as many entries of these establishments in the suburbs as we saw exits downtown. Right? And so again, this comes back to sort of an equitable future for cities. Perhaps some of these service jobs will move to the suburbs, and so that's a negative in terms of creating commutes for your downtown residents, but perhaps they're not going to actually be replaced one for one. And so there could be some of the gains in terms of wages that we were looking at, and that college-educated workers or people who can work remotely are gaining in terms of wages and time won't be shared, and there'll be a reverse effect at the other end of the income and skill distribution. Next. Okay, Jill.
Let me talk briefly about the second amplifying mechanism next. So this is about agglomeration effects, but before we go there, let's try to think a little bit more about this debate that Nick evoked about is that more productive or less productive to work from home? So as Jesse will just mention, working from home has a strong skill bias, but much of the research, which is like the best research, is really, really interesting, very nicely done, but it's about unskilled people working from home as opposed to skilled people working from home, because people working in a call center, we can measure their productivity in a way that, when Jesse and I interact in the paper in person versus at home and stuff, it's really, really hard to measure, right? So what this literature finds is that actually there's a productivity premium working from home, but it's for a very specific group that may or may not be representative of the others. The broader evidence, asking people, asking firms and stuff, is all over the place, ranging from, it's a reasonably big positive to it's a huge negative, like minus 30%. Like a minus 30% productivity shock would be huge for the economy. So the answer is, I think we don't know. Arguably, this is the single most important factor we're looking forward about the importance of work from home. Next. So, making things more complicated, we've talked about that already, or they've talked about that already in the first session. The difference, the productivity advantage or disadvantage working from home versus working from the office will vary across occupations. If you're a waiter, waiting tables at home is, you're not going to get huge tips for that. Teaching for us, so much better in person, right? Oh boy, so much better in person. So, and then, there'll be, for some of us, there are tasks like teaching for me where I want to be in person, and tasks where indeed I'm perfectly happy to stay home for the day and actually make progress and type stuff on a paper or deal with a backlog of emails or whatever what I'm doing with my days. So what's going to happen is that people will probably bundle and rebundle their tasks differently, but we've talked about that already this morning. There's a lot of complications also associated with the fact that our productivity depends on the patterns of the others. Great for me, I'm working with Jessie, I know she's in the office every day. That's a happy place. I'm in the office maybe 3 days a week, but coordinating if both of us are 3 days a week in a random fashion is going to become harder. So there's a huge challenge, and I think firms are still trying to figure it out. I think the interesting or the new thing I want to bring here is that there's an interesting precedent, which is actually when firms started having employees in different locations. Until the railroads, firms had employees in only one location, and it's thanks actually to a number of interesting innovations. So the Zoom of the late 19th century was actually the carbon copy. The carbon copy, suddenly you could type in instructions that could be sent to like 5 remote sites. It was a really big deal. It was a huge time saver. And the other one was vertical filing, like suddenly being able to organize stuff in a meaningful way. Believe it or not, so for management, vertical filing was a huge thing. So today it's Zoom, but I think we need to understand that. And I think the economic history actually of the late 19th century changes in work patterns associated with multi-establishment firms is probably quite relevant here. Next. So then indirect effects, agglomeration. It's why we have cities in the first place, is that we are more productive together than separately. At the same time, the consensus numbers are not very big. Those agglomeration effects are modest because, people in New York are more productive. They make much higher wages than Topeka or Wichita or smaller places like this. It's a nearly 1-to-2 ratio. But much of that is actually explained by the fact that many people in that room would also be very productive over there and make higher wages. So the agglomeration effect is actually not that big because New York is immensely bigger, immensely denser, and will have a 30 to 50% productivity premium, which translates into a 2 to 8% agglomeration elasticity. So even if downtown becomes 40% empty, it's a reduction of 4% in productivity. That's bad, but not awful. That's like 3 years of growth, right? With 3 years of productivity growth. And that's really the worst case scenario. Next. Because I think things are actually not as bad in the sense that those agglomeration effects come from we have different reasons. We are more productive because we can get supplies from other firms. But here it doesn't really rely on face-to-face contact, a lot of it, right? Akron and Detroit were working in sync for many, many years. Akron was producing tires that were sent to Detroit and put in the cars. And they didn't need to be together. There's 200 miles between the two cities, and everything was fine. So it means that here it doesn't really depend on some of those agglomeration effects have a much broader scale than we think. Same thing with, we also think that a lot of those effects are coming from sick local labor markets. The fact that, okay, you want to change job, here's just 1 million jobs around and it will be easy to find something else. Wichita is going to be harder, especially if you're really specialized into one thing, right? Here, if you're doing finance, there's lots of other players that could hire you. In Wichita, not so much. So, there's been some work trying to disentangle between those effects, not very successful. So, when Barack Obama went after bin Laden, he said it was a 50-50. There was a lot of uncertainty, so 50-50. Here, there's a lot of uncertainty, but I have 3 alternatives. So it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So if I divide my 4% from before by 3, associated really with the face-to-face contact and all those benefits, we're talking again about really, really small effects. Next. So we could look also at those agglomeration effects. More spatially, people have done that, and again, they're finding them at different scale. So the very local scale, it matters, but it may not be huge. Next, because I think we're already well over time, so some conclusions. Next. So we think the key story about COVID for cities is the rise in work from home. We've seen so far step 1 of the process where people have revisited their housing choices. within cities as they existed pre-COVID. So we've seen this rising house prices, flattening of wealth gradients, and a huge amount of resorting across cities with indeed rich or more skilled people willing to move, sometimes a lot further away. As we argue that work from home has had so far both costs and benefits, reduce commuting, but at the same time having to devote part of your home to some home office. So again, the sum of these two is actually maybe a small positive, and then some indirect cost, reduced agglomeration economies maybe, and that's going to be a small negative, and maybe a much bigger effect. We haven't fully estimated that with Jesse, but this hollowing out of urban amenities. But the good news here is that, as soon as people come back, maybe those amenities, or likely those amenities will come back equally quickly, so we're not too worried about that, so that may be a temporary effect. Next, and then looking forward, physical layout velocities will adjust, so there will be this slow adjustment that Ingrid is going to talk about this afternoon of the office space in urban centers with some potential for some renaissance here. There's a strong residential push outward. Not all cities will allow for that, but some cities will, and jobs and people will actually move to those cities, I think, in the long run. So let's actually expose ourselves and open to criticisms, but let me put forward two policy challenges for New York City. We think that the city should be about trying to help with that adjustment, which sometimes, it's New York, there's lots of sub-centers of employment. Maybe not all of them will do well, and maybe some hard choices will need to be made. So that's number one. And number two, people want to consume more housing. Let's convert as much as we can other stuff that was being used for other things towards housing, and let's also push for more housing at the periphery. New York doesn't need to push its urban fringe beyond Allentown, PA. That's probably not that reasonable, but there's a lot of space outside that could be used a lot more efficiently and could be well densified. And I understand that this is slightly above the mandate of the city because that's other municipalities. So, you want that? No, we don't need that.
Well, one nice thing about this panel is that you hopefully won't hear the words "you're on mute" at any point, except for just now. Thank you for that really interesting presentation, and I think that sets us off for a great conversation. But I want to bring it more specifically to New York, which is obviously such a unique example when talking about cities and economics and the tax base, the economic base, et cetera. And I want to start off just by reading a couple of statistics that shocked me. The journal, three of my colleagues a few weeks ago wrote a story about how people still want to live in New York City, rents are still going up, housing prices are going up, but they don't want to work in Manhattan anymore. So here's a couple statistics that were quite amazing to me. Manhattan is home to nearly 11% of all office inventory in the US as of last year. The office sector in 2019 employed 1.6 million people, a third of all New York City jobs, and contributed 2/3 of the city's gross product. Manhattan has a daytime workforce larger than the entire population of Houston. An estimated 2.6 million people worked in the borough 3 years ago, 70% of whom commuted in from other parts of the city or its suburbs. So New York is in a very unique position when it comes to the impacts of work from home. So I want to start with Kathy and Mark to get some response to that. One thing that really fascinated me about your presentation was this concept of the urban renaissance and the consumer economy. But as we see, New York's economy is so deeply, deeply entrenched in its business, financial sectors. And so the loss of some of that could be huge. So I want to ask Mark and Kathy, what incentives are there for firms to continue to locate in New York City and to stay in New York City at a time when they're having it's difficult to get their workers to be here, and their workers increasingly don't want to be here?
I disagree.
Great.
I think Number one, I think you need to distinguish between work from home and remote work. They are not the same. Some remote workers work from home, some remote workers work from other places, and in fact, there's been increasing demand from remote workers that offices be set up where they are. So I don't think I just think a lot of the assumptions about what we're talking about in the phenomenon, I would say, are at this point uncertain. We just surveyed about 10,000 office workers about what their feelings were about the city, the status of the city coming back to work. And the biggest number was 82% responded that they're going to be watching carefully what happens in the city in the next year and making decisions about both their work and where they're going to live. So I think it's the wrong time to be drawing conclusions. Certainly employers are feeling that they've got to be very tentative about making permanent changes, whether it's hybrid work or anything else, at this moment in history as we are still in the throes of everybody getting sick. So I think that would be my first caveat, is we don't know. Remote work is, since in the last 2 years, we've gone from 4% of the job postings for New York City being remote to over 10% of the job postings for New York City being remote. But again, it's not necessarily work from home. It could be doing engineering work in Israel for a New York City office. And the biggest challenge, to go to your question about employer incentives, the biggest challenge that we're worried about is the relocation of offices following workers that have clustered, particularly in Florida at this point. But that's what we're nervous about, is do we see, because it affects our tax rolls, it affects a lot of things in the economy of the city. During the COVID, in the last 2 years, the New York economy has only lost 5.5% of its economic output. And that was basically in the tourism, accommodations, face-to-face service, retail industries. Basically, everything else thrived. The office environment thrived, was very successful, but that's not sustainable over the long term in the view of employers. They think that we won't have the level of burnout among employees, the mental health issues, suicides, et cetera. I mean, there have been a lot of repercussions of the kind of pressure that's been put on. So I would just say that those are kind of real world experiences that we're seeing every day, and that the big takeaway for us is don't make permanent decisions right now. People are not making permanent decisions right now. One other thing, I think you totally underestimate the resistance of the suburbs and the exurbs to the kind of change that this implies. We just saw our very popular new governor tried to do transit-oriented housing in the suburbs, tried to do accessory dwelling units in the housing, and it was shot down. I mean, for the suburbs, this is bigger than the crime problem. So I don't see, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, I don't see a dramatic change. I don't think the housing is going to be there. The reason prices went up in the suburbs is because they don't build anything. They've, the value went up with the existing inventory.
Mark?
Hey, thank you. First of all, I'd like to petition for my PhD in economics.
Yeah, exactly, I'm with you.
For a great presentation, but it reminded me of being back in economics class. But I appreciate the observations and want to agree with Kathy in many respects, but I want to say this. New York is different. And drawing conclusions from the experiences of New York to any other city is really a fool's errand. New York is a unique place. I've lived here in this region now for 18 years. Of course, I'm a native of New Orleans, spent 20 years after returning from law school back to New Orleans, and lead an organization that has a presence in 92 cities across the nation. So there's very few places I haven't been, haven't seen, haven't experienced, or not in some ways connected to. Having said that, it is too early to really draw long-term conclusions because we're just easing out of the pandemic. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was anxiety, nervousness, and resistance to working from home, whether you could do it. I did not know what the word Zoom meant before March of 2020, other than some ads I saw when I traveled through airports. Now, of course, it's part of our lexicon, and it is easy to do meetings, et cetera, during Zoom. Employers are going to weigh, and there's a tension here. We have 110 employees right here in the financial district. National Urban League, 80 Pine Street. Had I surveyed them and said, do y'all want to continue to work from home or come back to the office? The work from home would have won. But I said, no, we're coming back to the office now 3 days a week and 2 days from home, because from my perspective, I see all the drop balls from working from home as a chief executive officer. I see the diminution in collaboration and in conversation. I see the difficulty in onboarding new employees. I see employees who whisper to me and say, you know, I'm only busy 50% of the time when I'm at home. That's my perspective, right? As time goes on, employers are going to evaluate and weigh. Google, which had allowed its people to stay at home, said, okay, everybody come back. You're going to see employers weigh and evaluate, adjust and change as they try to find the proper equilibrium between remote working, working from home, and working in the office. It is too early to tell. The large question is whether this represents a wholesale reversal, of people wanting to be in the city, really something that millennials and Gen Zs and younger people who may delay starting families, non-traditional families, may have brought, and you see the renaissance in city centers all across the nation. Is that a reversal of that trend, or is it a slowing down or easing of that trend? The other thing that makes New York different is lots of people here have second residences. That's not common in most parts of the United States. And so some people say, well, I want to work remotely, but they're not making a decision to sell a property and buy a new property. They're just making a decision to work from a second property or from being with a family member. We lost several employees. They decided to go back to places like Texas and others. They gave up their apartments in the city and went back to go live with parents or sisters or other family members. And few of them will return to working for us. And that's a consequence. And they said, well, can I continue to work from here? And I said, no. Because I'm trying to build a collaborative environment. I have to punch above our weight. I have to have people eyeball each other, know each other, debate each other. An enterprise is not a collection of individuals. It's a whole. Employers are going to weigh. So mainly it is too early to tell. New York stands alone because I think that the pendulum could swing a bit here, but I don't know how far it is going to swing because the cultural attractions, the restaurants and the theaters and the music and the things that New York City has will never be replicated in the suburbs or the exurbs of America. And so if people decide that they want to live in an exurb or a suburb, they are trading off, some things for other things. Final thing I'll say about housing in general, because yesterday I was at the National Press Club and addressed the National Housing Conference on the overall issue of housing. We have a systemic problem with housing in this country. We're 4 million units underwater. We haven't produced housing units in the 21st century. We haven't kept pace. And that's going to push up prices in the exurbs, the suburbs, urban communities, big towns, small cities. You're going to see some dipping and shifting based on demand, but when you have such a tight supply problem, there's just not going to be, I think, any real bargains because of the shifts of 8 to 10% of people here or there.
Thank you. Hearing your perspective as an employer is really interesting. First of all, I can't believe you have employees who actually admit to you that they are only busy 50% of the time at home.
My job
I would
as
never
a
tell my
boss
editor
is
that.
to have lots of relationships and lots of eyeballs, right?
But what you're saying as an employer is very different from what Gilles was saying in the presentation about how the actual productivity advantage of being together is quite small. But I think maybe that also understates. I mean, I've interviewed employers and they'll say, when it comes to retention of employees, if they have people working from home, they're like 2 or 3 times more likely to quit because they don't develop those relationships. So I think that's a piece of the, the productivity that maybe we don't take into account as much.
I would also say that the collaboration issue also depends on the type of job, the type of work, the type of business, the type of enterprise. If you're in some creative industries, if you are in what we do, which is a combination of program and advocacy, we're smaller. We have to have cross-functional teams. People can't work on one thing. If you're a big enterprise, you might have one job, one type of job. You may be doing similar types of things. Could my accounts payables person work from home? Yes. Could my payroll person work from home? Yes, right? Could some people work from home on a full-time basis? Yes, but when it's to troubleshoot a problem, to deal with an issue, if every time they want to troubleshoot a problem, deal with an issue, they got to send an email, they got to do a text, they got to set up a Zoom. As opposed to saying, hey, Teresa, I'll come see you in 2 minutes. Have a 30-second conversation, solve the problem, it's done. That's the workplace. And if you turn every conversation into a scheduled Zoom, a text or email, during COVID, I literally had a list. I had to keep a list of all the emails I got to send, of all the people I got to connect. In my normal day, it'd be 25% emails and maybe 75% 30-second conversations, right? That I would have to solve problems, to do things. And so I think employers are going to sort this out, and there's no one time. But look, there's also an advantage for white-collar, college-educated workers. The hospital nurse cannot work from home. The physician cannot see all their patients from home, right? If you're doing accounting and audits and things like that, you could work from home. You could work remotely. I mean, I think that this is going to be more nuanced than it is going to be. But employees, at some point, a young person is going to say, I also want lifestyle. So if I'm living way out in the middle of nowhere, that's what's caused younger people to move to the cities. It's the cultural amenities, it's interactivity, it's the ability to meet and greet people. That's difficult to measure. That's really difficult to measure and put into any sort of economic model, I would say. And that's part of, I think, Kathy, the appeal in New York City.
Agree. I wanted to ask about this thing about the home office tax, which I don't think I got exactly what you meant by that, because related to what we're saying, somebody who's out of the office long term, especially young people, are not going to learn as much, and people who are outside the office are not going to have the same upward mobility, the same promotions, because we know how that stuff works, and you don't get that in isolation. So it seems to me that runs against this concept of a home office tax, if I'm understanding what you were saying.
Can I take that?
Yeah.
So I'm going to answer your question, then I'm going to step back just a bit because I think we need to provide a little bit of context for the exercise. So on the home office tax, I think what we're thinking about, I think, we basically left it to the first presentations of the day, the first session, to say there's going to be some amount of work from home, right? They're just like, there is. We're not saying that everyone's going to work from home, but there'll be some jobs where people are working from home, and that there will be these sort of, seemingly small adjustments in the number of people who want to live in the suburbs or they're going to work from home, so they want an extra room in their house, right, is what we're effectively thinking there. You know, some type of home office, or you want some larger dining room. And the tax, why we're thinking about it as a tax is you're not getting any consumption value or utility from that room, right? So it's a different thing from saying the tax is to your, you know, in the decision to work from home or not. It's saying if you work from home, one of the downsides.
So you're saying it's a disincentive to work from home?
Yeah,
It's a cost.
but
It's a cost.
So the idea of our exercise, this is where I'm going to
So
step
how
back.
do you pay for it if you're not getting the raises because you're not on premises and kissing up to the boss?
So that will depend on that's the argument about the demand for housing. Yeah, I mean, in my own experience, half of our bedroom became my office, and we had a den that was also a guest bedroom that became my wife's office. And it means that a big chunk of
Okay,
the house.
so I'm going to cut in. I'm just going to step back, and I'm going to say we're not here to litigate. Should people work from home or not? I'm totally with you. Gilles said my happy place is the office. I think they're a really problematic. I think people are being very myopic and saying I want to work from home making that and jumping to make that decision now, because I agree. I think in the long run, upward, trajectory. We're thinking about in the event that a certain share of the population make this decision to work from home. In the event that happens, this is where cities go.
But
I understood. You see, I
forces.
understood it to mean, I think you explained it, and this is what I thought they were saying, Kathy, is that if people shift to work from home, they're going to want additional space in their home, so they have a dedicated office as opposed to sitting at the dining room table, in the basement, in the attic.
With the kids.
With the
And
kids,
the
so
thing is,
wherever they are, right, that they're going to try to
gonna cost
position themselves. But I think the more interesting thing is what it will do to home designs, to the construction of new homes, whether you're going to have homes being built now that have work from home spaces, areas that are specifically designed, apartments that are specifically designed with some space carved out, a corner, a room, a half of a room that gives people an opportunity to work from home. I think that's more likely to be a trend. I think that I think you are saying if I move out to wherever and I need space to work, I'm going to need a different type of space. Maybe I need more space. Is that the concept?
Yeah, we're effectively saying
you're
that
kind of projecting
if
that.
you've made the choice to work from home, you're going to demand a bit of extra space, and then bringing it back to sort of the idea of the city and what you were saying, Kathy, where you're saying like the fear is that these firms choose to move. I think what we're thinking there is when Gilles was saying, when you demand more space and you have to commute less, the tendency is that you're going to want to move into a larger unit, and larger units tend to be further out from the city. Okay, so that's just the nature.
I'm
and
absolutely.
the issue is if the city, it's almost like the city against the suburbs, because if the suburbs aren't willing to let housing supply expand in the suburbs, then that might be problematic for New York in terms of businesses.
That aren't willing to.
I know, that's what I said.
Yeah.
I said, so it's like, is the issue the suburbs? But there's also an opportunity here is if you have hundreds of thousands of square feet of office space that in a year or two can get, maybe not a year or two, 5 years, converted into this type of well-designed space so that young people and people can come and live here and enjoy all the amenities that New York has to offer, and maybe they won't replace one-to-one the foot traffic of the previous office workers, but they'll.
I would say this too.
They can live
this is
here.
an interesting thing because I'm in the process of hiring several more people, and I had 2 people turn down offers because they wanted a commitment and an arrangement that they could work from home, and I said no. Right, because I said, I don't know what we're going to do, right? I don't want my hands tied. And we're 3-2 now, and I said, look, if we can make 3-2 work, 3-2 may last for a long time. If 3-2 doesn't work, we might be 4-1. It all depends on what is required to get the mission fulfilled and the job done versus being straitjacketed in to some mentality or some mindset about how things are. And that's why I think it's too early to tell. I noticed as an employer, and people, I don't want to come back, I don't want to come back. Then when they come back, they're so glad to see everybody. And then their mood is positive, and I have interactivity. And how have you been doing? And what have you been doing? And you know, some people's appearance may change in one way or another, or they've added someone to their family, or they've changed it. I mean, human interactivity is a very necessary part of making an enterprise successful. And I think employers are going to find that balancing is going to be. I also think there's something in a workplace. Let's take a hospital, right? Where the frontline workers have to come to work, and then the people in the back office are staying at home. What does that do for the morale?
Well, that's what's going
Morale
on.
of
That's
an
the problem in the
enterprise.
city
These are
with the
equity
city
issues.
Yeah,
workers.
it's an equity
Yeah.
issue. You
Yeah.
know, like, look at these. Well, you know, they make more money than me, and they don't have to come here. And I'm here dealing with all the difficult issues and the difficult problems. So an employer, a good manager, leader, employer, thinks about those kinds of things. I can't have tension and morale because I'm trying to bend to everybody's agenda, right? I got to create some basic equilibrium that's fair for everyone if I'm going to have an enterprise. Yeah. And so, you know, it's what I like to wake up every day, put my warm-up clothes on, work out, and then never, ever, ever have to change clothes all day. Just take my little jacket, put it on over my T-shirt. Yeah, of course, yeah. But it's not sustainable for the mission of my organization.
Sorry, I want to get to a few more questions before our time is up, but I think, you know, you mentioned the equity issue here. Some of these are issues not just employers have to figure out. There are also issues for policymakers, for state, federal, local governments, and I'm curious what role do policymakers have in making sure that these cities, you know, our cities remain vibrant, especially a city like New York, and that we have these, you know, continue to have a critical mass of businesses, workers, you know, creative class, all these different kinds of people. I'm curious, Kathy, what your
Well, I was
take is.
surprised during the discussion we didn't bring up the consequences of urban sprawl in terms of the impact on climate change, because there is nothing more efficient than a city and its mass transit system and the aggressive actions we're taking to upgrade buildings. So I think that's one huge set of issues that particularly is going to resonate with young people as they see the consequences and the dependence on automobiles, electric or not, in the suburbs. So I think that's going to be a force that's going to affect this conversation as people get over their gross preoccupation with the COVID and start to think about the other things that are important to our lives. So that would be one.
I would say this. I think, you know, put my hat on as a policymaker who would lead, run, care about a city. You know, I'd be deeply concerned about a return to the past, where there's this mass migration out of the city, leaving the city's center to decline. And then we're just going to have another reversal and another pendulum shift. And I would be very concerned about trying to maintain some stability. So I might be in the mindset of trying to create incentives for businesses, financial supports. We're managing a program now that gives grants, equity grants, to Black-owned restaurants in 10 cities. New York's not one of them, who shut down or who were impacted or affected. So it's a privately funded initiative. But the idea is if you're leading a city, you want to get these businesses back into operation. They're employers, they're taxpayers, they create vibrancy. You don't want to have all these vacancies in neighborhoods and communities. So a policymaker is going to think in, you know, perhaps think in those terms. What can I do to accelerate the return, particularly of small businesses and neighborhood-based businesses who are generally thinly capitalized and who create the fabric of a neighborhood.
The other big issue that I want to mention is immigration that we didn't bring up here. The fact that we have the most restrictive immigration policies today in this country's history between Trump and COVID is a real reason why this inflow of people to the city has been so slow. We open up those spigots, and all of a sudden there's going to be a competition from people who are more than willing to work in New York City or other city offices. And so if we can deal with the immigration process, I think it's going to change this whole equation. And all of a sudden, the luxury of working from home will not be there for these folks.
That's a great point.
And I have 5-0 in my office.
It's a great point. I want to bring up something that I think seems also very unique to New York, which is business travel. As people can use, like so many
That's
of the,
going to change permanently.
Yes, so many of the amenities that make New York, New York, things like 5-star restaurants, which those of us who live here wish we could or like to enjoy. A lot of that is supported by expense accounts of people coming in from other places.
Employment is down 30%, and it's not going to be what it was, and a lot of that is the change in business travel, because it was both a magnet in, people going out, people entertaining, et cetera, and I think that is going to be a major area of change. But that whole sector of our economy, accommodations, restaurants, et cetera, face-to-face services, it's only 9% of our economy, it's 20% of the jobs. So there's this whole dislocation of people from these relatively low-wage jobs that's the big issue. Again, that's a different issue than the remote office worker.
Do you see changes in leisure travel? What's the trend on that?
No, I don't. I think leisure travel is going to bounce back bigger than ever.
But can tourism replace some of that activity from the business
If it's
travel?
international, the spend is just as good. And I think during the COVID, the last year, the biggest Brazilian restaurant owner opened their first restaurant in New York, and Tim Zagat told me the other day it's the #1 restaurant. So
I'll give another example. So I was in my hometown, New Orleans, 2 weeks ago. I spent a week there, and was at the convention center, the Montreal Convention Center. It's actually named after my father, and asked the director what business was like, because in New Orleans, business travel is really convention travel, meetings travel. And he said that he was almost 80% back in terms of the number of shows and the magnitude of business, which I was surprised. I thought it would be much lower. The leisure travel, interestingly, has come back, almost has surged, right? You had a huge Mardi Gras. The music festivals, the big three, which are the French Quarter Fest, the Jazz Fest, and the Essence Fest, are coming back. The numbers for those are expected to be very large. So New York's business travel is of a different character, because there's people coming here to do deals, to do meetings. It's meetings, it's less huge conventions. A place like New Orleans, the business traveler is big conventions and trade shows, but the leisure travel. So I think it's interesting. It's an interesting question away from New York, because I do agree business travel is going to be less. How much can be made up, by other forms of hospitality and tourism? Because people have been pent up for 2 years, and the demand and the desire to get out and about, I think, is very strong.
On the equity side of this, obviously I think one thing that COVID exposed was just how truly interdependent, we all are. The loss of so many lower wage jobs, especially early in the pandemic. Now they're coming back. Now there's actually a labor shortage for a lot of those jobs. But I'm curious about sort of the job sorting, long-term effects on job sorting. And I wonder if any of you have any predictions, including, Jesse and Gilles, on sort of where jobs, and I know this came up also in the previous panel, but, long-term winners, long-term losers in terms of jobs and real estate and housing.
I've got opinions. I've always got opinions.
And I know Kathy said it's too early to make predictions and a lot can still change.
That's
we'll make
different.
predictions.
That's the shift from the service economy to the digital economy, and jobs are just going to follow that dramatically. It's been greatly accelerated by the COVID. They're going to change completely, and education and skills training and credentialing are all going to be critically important.
And in
So
the
we
80s.
see this
Go ahead.
So we see these low skills jobs, and it was like really indeed was striking well early on when the high skilled people or the more highly paid people stop showing up. The others basically lose their job, and so it's as people come back to the centers, those activities will come back. But I think long term there will be also more consumption outside of the centers, and I think some of those jobs will decentralize.
The whole move to e-commerce is not going to be reversed. People have gotten used to that convenience, and it's not going to change.
I think we have to be mindful, policymakers have to be mindful, business leaders have to be mindful of, a dual status workplace, where you have people who are college educated, upper income, they're going to mostly be white, who have flexibility and the ability to work from home and the ability to work remotely and work from Florida or work from Canada or work from Israel or work from wherever they are, versus people who have to do it the old-fashioned way. Punch a clock, come in, work every day. And I think we have to, there's profound issues about society involved in that, and the ability for everyone to see themselves as pushing the same rock in the same way. I think we have to be very concerned about that, and I think policymakers and employers have to pay attention. It's an equity issue, but it's also an issue of cohesion and collaboration and cooperation, in a workplace. And so it should not be diminished or underestimated in terms of that being an issue or becoming even a more profound issue, because in the pandemic, the frontline workers who had to come to work were also much more at risk, much more capable of being infected and being placed in a situation where their health is at risk. And so we have got to really, really pay attention to that element as an inequity element. The final thing I'll say, though, if the prices of housing in New York City went down, if rents went down, that's good for affordable housing. So, there's always a silver lining inside of a lot of clouds, but maybe it's not going to go down that much.
We only have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to get to your last slide. Gilles said there will be hard trade-offs. I mean, what the final slide was, I don't remember exactly the term. There will be difficult decisions to make, difficult trade-offs. I'm curious to hear from any of you, what difficult trade-offs do you see coming up for New York?
So to me, the point was, you have all those sub-centers. New York is a really big place. And if only 80% of the people, we could argue forever about the numbers, but not everybody is going to come back, and not everybody is going to come back all the time. So in order for those places, for those centers to remain vibrant, places that people want to go to, and so on and so forth, there's a huge coordination problem, because it may not be everywhere back at the same time, or may not be, some places may never come back. And I think the city is also in the business of, between us, with Jesse, we say mall manager. Part of the mall may need to be shut down, and they need to
converted.
Or converted.
Right.
And that's the job of the city to, because otherwise everybody is going to sit down and wait, and we've talked a lot about that, and I couldn't agree more, like everybody is trying to figure out what's going to happen, and sometimes you need, well, the job of the government is to provide leadership and say, okay, we'd like things to be like this, and maybe those places we need to change character and function and so on and so forth.
Just a one-liner. Yeah. We're way ahead on that. The real estate industry has been building throughout the COVID. The new office buildings that have come online are spectacular, and everybody wants to be in them. The rents are higher than they've ever been in the new office buildings. The old inventory is suffering. It's going to be more torn down than converted, but a lot of it is going to go for residential and mixed use and retail and entertainment development. But it's not being led by the government. It's really being led by our very creative real estate industry, which doesn't miss a beat.
I think we are at time. So thank you so much for your,
Thank you, Lauren.
your comments.
It was really interesting. I enjoyed your stuff.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking
Thank
about.
you very much.